Welcome to the next installment in AlertFind's webinar series. Today we are talking no threat too large or small business continuity planning for today's risks. You can join the conversation on Twitter using the hashtags business continuity or AF webinar, and we'll be live tweeting at AlertFindCom. I am so thrilled to welcome back today Robert Clark, a business continuity consultant, author, and trainer. Robert Clark is a fellow of the Institute of Business Continuity Management, a fellow of the British Computer Society, and a member of the Security Institute. He has extensive business continuity experience, including 15 years at IBM, 11 years at Fujitsu, and in 2010, Clark became a BCI-approved trainer running BCI-licensed courses. Clark's first business continuity book, In Hindsight, a compendium of business continuity case studies, was #1 on Amazon. His other publications include Business Continuity and the Pandemic Threat, and the newly released Crisis Management, Is Social Media Its Best Friend or Worst Nightmare? Bob, welcome back. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you very much, Danielle. It's great to be back.
And I'm your moderator today, Danielle Ricci, the Vice President of Marketing for AlertFind. Today we're going to be covering the diverse set of risks that companies face, how business continuity planning helps companies prepare, how the core elements of business continuity planning work together to protect businesses, and the critical role that governance plays in the process. So, Bob, let's just jump right in. Can you talk to me about the way that business continuity is evolving right now?
Yes, but before I do, Danielle, if I may, I'd just like to say something about the title of the webinar, No Threat Too Large or Small. A lot of organizations can be guilty of focusing on big ticket items, or if you like, major high profile threats when they're actually preparing their BCP. But they also need to be mindful of the little things that can trip them up too. And two examples that come to mind is one, a fire in a cupboard, which was put out by a security guard. May seem fairly innocuous, but the guns that have been sucked up by the air conditioning unit from that fire was then being spewed out all around the office block for about a month, and they couldn't use it. So a small incident caused a major headache for the company. And another one was a workman accidentally drilling through a water pipe. So the large tank on the roof of this building emptied its contents into the office block below. The server room was on the ground floor. Some of the equipment was actually on the floor. And believe you me, water and electricity do not go well together. So I'd just like people to keep in mind that don't just focus on the big things. Also remember there are little things that can go wrong too. Now, the slide you've got in front of you there just gives an overview of how business continuity has evolved. Back in the 60s and early 70s, it was all about disaster recovery, protecting IT assets, protecting the electronic data of large organizations, banks in particular. IBM's mentioned there is another one. Then as we got into the 80s, organizations became more aware that there are other assets to protect, such as buildings and people. We also saw in the late 80s the creation of the Disaster Recovery Institute in the States, and that was followed a year or two later by the Business Continuity the Business Continuity Institute in the UK. And that gave a strong indication, I think, that business continuity was being taken more seriously. But at the time, there were no serious standards to speak of that we could say that's how we should be doing things and so on. If we move on to the next slide, what we've got there is the iconic picture of the New York skyline, which reminds us, where the Twin Towers once stood. Following that unprecedented terrorist attack, the economic effects were far-reaching, and close to 600,000 people lost their jobs. 600,000 people. Around about half of that was in the tourist industry. But nevertheless, that was a painful time in more ways than one. The 9/11 attack also gave us a wake-up call, a massive wake-up call, because there were no internationally recognized business continuity standards in place. and the fledgling industry, if you like, had to react fairly quickly. Now, what we saw in the decade that followed was a number of standards come online, and by 2012, I think it was, the first international standard, ISO 22301, was launched. Since then, we've seen other international standards created that make provision for the likes of the cyber threat and deal with ICT disaster recovery, among others. And in the last few years, we've seen a significant deterioration in things like terrorism and a serious shift in the way that terrorists attack. Now, we've also seen the adoption of threat horizons, and analysis in recent times is helping us to better understand what is loitering with intent just over the horizon. And things like climate change, poor air quality in our cities, water shortages, and I think we may even see some wars caused by water shortages. The issue of plastic being dumped into sea, which at the very least threatens our food chain and the tourism industry. So I fully expect that we will continue to see business continuity evolve. And in fact, only this year, the Business Continuity Institute has published its latest version of good practice guidelines. And I'm sure in 3-4 years' time, we'll see another version of that set of guidelines practice, along with other standards that are being produced around the world. So that's what's happening in the industry. And in some cases, we are reacting. In other cases, I'd like to think we are preempting, but we can't get it right all the time.
And so how is the emergence of these new threats affecting the business continuity process?
Well, as I mentioned with 9/11, that was a massive wake-up call. And the industry responded by developing standards to help us better prepare, to actually measure where we were in terms of the effectiveness of our business continuity programs. Now, they can also provide us with learning experiences that actually test our ability to respond. But there can be situations where a new threat emerges. I mean, this happened with cyber threat, of course. And many organizations, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises, struggled, and in some cases still struggle because of the need to have specialist cybersecurity staff to deal with the situation. What a lot of people may not realize that every day there's something like 300,000 new threats that find their way into cyberspace. You know, that's scary. That's massive. And I won't say we're managing that and managing that well. We're struggling. And even organizations like Symantec and McAfee, who provide products for protecting our security, they can't keep up with it. They are responding to the threats as they appear. So there are situations where we are going to be caught out, and I'm sure that will continue, but we still need to continue to be resilient as best we can. And where we find a hole in the way we operate, a hole in our procedures, then we need to respond quickly to fix that.
So when they're getting started, what are the core principles that business continuity managers need to understand as they, embark on this process?
Well, first and foremost, business continuity management is a holistic process, and it's also cyclic. So first, that means when someone's getting involved in business continuity, they shouldn't look at the process and think, I like the look of that, I understand that, no, I don't fancy doing that. So they shouldn't be cherry picking. They shouldn't start by writing a business continuity plan before they've actually understood the basic prerequisites. What are the business drivers for actually writing a business continuity plan? If you understand those, it's conceivable that you conclude that we don't actually need a business continuity plan. On the other hand, it could be just the opposite, that we need one and we need one desperately. So what are the core principles? First, there's governance, which I'll talk about a little later if I may. But then there are 4 basic technical disciplines to undertake. You need to understand your business, and this involves performing what is called the business impact analysis. In fact, we covered that in a previous webinar. In this particular process, you identify your key products, services and processes to make sure you understand how quickly they need to be recovered after an incident. Now, are we talking days, weeks, months? And this is followed by analyzing the threats that your organization faces and performing a risk assessment, so you know what could disrupt your ability to continue with your product creation or offering services and so on. You may also need to perform a gap analysis. This is usually the case for organizations that have created an IT disaster recovery plan before they've created a business continuity plan, because the ICT plan may well have not taken into consideration the business drivers because perhaps they weren't understood fully at the time. And I found situations where organizations just do not have a business continuity plan and a disaster recovery plan that goes hand in hand, and they must. Now, the second step is where we consider the most appropriate strategies to use. So here we've understood the business, we've defined the threats, we understand how quickly we need to recover everything and so on and so forth. And we need to look at what could interrupt the organization, how we're going to respond, and how quickly we need to respond. Some organizations may say, well, hang on, if we have an interruption to our business, that is something we cannot accept. And they may spread their operation across multiple sites to reduce any risk of stoppage. Others may have the luxury of time to recover their operations and may take the view that we'll fix the problem once they understand exactly what's gone wrong. I have to say, there are a few I've come across that seem to be depending on what I would call divine intervention, although, this isn't a strategy I would recommend. The third step, once you've identified the strategy you're going to follow, is to actually write the business continuity plan itself. And simplistically, this will identify what action should be taken when specific incidents occur. This may well be linked with other plans that an organization has, such as an incident management or a crisis management plan, an emergency preparedness plan, pandemic plan, communications plan, ICT disaster recovery plan that I mentioned later. Business continuity management does not believe in reinventing the wheel. So if these plans already exist, use them. It makes your life so much easier. The final step is one which, for a number of reasons, organizations sometimes do not do, or they just pay lip service to. And that is validating that your business continuity plan actually works. Now, the last thing you want to find out is that your plan is flawed when you're faced with a serious incident. Personally, I'm yet to be involved in any BCP exercise, or for that matter, an ICT disaster recovery exercise, when the plan has worked in its entirety. There's always been something that has necessitated going back and taking another look, even if it's just been dotting an I or crossing a T. And in some cases, there needs to be serious rework done to fix whatever the issues were. So those are effectively the steps that you need to go through. And as I mentioned, governance we'll talk about a little later in the webinar.
So how do you, as a business continuity professional, start to shift from a threat-specific response approach to a scenario or process-driven approach, like the one that you just talked about?
Yeah, there are some threats that, while they present very different risks to an organization, the end result can be similar. So, for example, if you cannot access, say, your head office, it might be because of a fire or a flood, industrial action, civil disturbance, an explosion, an earthquake, or something nasty arriving in the mail, such as anthrax. Now, the common effect of all these incidents is you cannot get into the building, so you're facing what I would call a denial of access situation. Now, you have to put some form of mitigation in place to reduce the probability and impact. And in the case of a fire, you may have put in fire extinguishers, a sprinkler system, or a fire suppression system in the data center. But when an incident stops you going into the building, what you need to be asking yourself is, how long is this going to last? A few hours, a few days, weeks, indefinitely, if the building's burnt down or something. Now, if it's going to be a few hours, management may instruct staff, oh, look, just go home and come back in the morning. And going to the other extreme, if you've lost the building, depending on how long you have to recover before your business is placed in serious jeopardy, maybe a matter of days, weeks, or months, as I said earlier, you should have your contingency measures in place to say, well, this is what we're going to do. You may have another building already in place. It may be empty. It may, here we get into what's called hot starts, warm starts, cold starts, in terms of how ready the building is to be occupied. And again, this is all driven by how quickly you need to recover based upon your understanding the business that I spoke about in the last slide. So in other examples of scenarios, ICT failure. Does the end user really need to know if it's a hardware or a software failure? A power failure, air conditioning's gone down, supplier failure, especially if you've outsourced IT or you use a cloud-based solution. To the business, IT has stopped working. In situations like that, it's more about the contingency plans that a business has in place to enable operations to continue, maybe to reduce level of service, while IT staff are addressing the cause of the problem. Another scenario that comes to mind is staff shortages that could result from people being injured at work, a pandemic I mentioned earlier, in industrial action, transport disruption, preventing them from getting to work, people leaving and obviously moving elsewhere. The bottom line is that whatever your contingency arrangements are, how are they going to deal with missing staff, who in some cases could be absolutely key to your operation? The advantage of adopting a scenario-based response is that from a contingency perspective, you're creating a single response to deal with several possible threats being realized, where they have the same effect and create the same symptom. So that's the key, as I see it, for the scenario approach.
So what are the core elements of a business continuity plan that businesses need to put in place to support this scenario-based approach?
Here we're talking about the threat analysis or the risk assessment. Now, just to make sure that everyone understands the difference, and there is a difference between a threat and a risk. If I, for example, said it might rain today, that's a threat. If I said there is a 40% likelihood of it raining today and the Met Office have predicted anything up to 10 centimeters of rain will fall, that's a risk. And the difference is that the risk has probability of occurring and a potential impact if it does occur. So that's the thing to keep in mind. Now, to be able to adopt a scenario-based approach, an organization needs to have conducted a threat analysis or risk assessment, if you prefer. There are a number of risk management processes out there, and I'm often asked, which one should we use? The simple answer is, if your organization already has a preferred risk management process, use that. Again, don't go and reinvent the wheel. When starting from scratch, though, I tend to encourage organizations to use a 5x5 matrix, and the slide that you have up at the minute is just an example of one. So here you've got the x-axis determining the probability of a risk occurring, while the y-axis determines the likely impact. The example on the screen is showing that the expectation of a pandemic occurring is high, and the likely impact is expected to be catastrophic. Conversely, an earthquake is showing a probability of medium-low with a corresponding medium-low impact. So if you compare these two examples, you're likely to be more concerned about the effects of a pandemic on your organization than an earthquake. Now, your risk assessment needs to consider all the threats that you've identified, and you're either going to rule them in or rule them out, as I'll talk about in a moment. So we're talking about not just the type of activity that's on the chart that is on the screen at the minute, but again, things like fire, flood, supply chain failure, industrial action, insider threat, adverse weather, theft, malicious damage, loss of data, and so on. But if you want a good example of a risk register, I would recommend go and look at the UK National Risk Register for 2017. It's available online, and it explains the rationale behind every one of the the risks that it actually has documented. And it uses a similar sort of matrix approach as you can see on the screen at the minute. It's the sort of thing which you could find a useful, if you're new to risk assessment, you could find it quite useful to look at, just to give you an understanding. But to stress, this is designed for civil emergencies, but it's the same process that organizations will go through if they're doing one for themselves. Okay.
And so how do you take all of this scenario, how do you put this scenario-based approach into action?
Okay, might be stating the obvious, but you need to complete your risk assessment. So you can decide which of the risks you're going to look to mitigate or develop some form of contingency plan. There'll also be those that aren't worth worrying about. And on the previous slide, they would have been down in the bottom left-hand quadrant or in that general area. There'll be those that you may say, well, actually, there's nothing we can do about that. And then there'll be those that management might decide to accept and live with. But if you're the business continuity manager, my recommendation to you is to always get that signed off in writing. Don't accept anything verbally. As one old manager said to me, if it's not in writing, it was never said or it didn't happen. And there's a lot of truth in that. Also remember that from organization to organization, the risk appetite can vary. So if you've got one which is less risk averse than another, it's likely to accept more risks than the one that may try and sort of come up with mitigation and contingency for everyone that it's identified. But, and here's a very important thing to remember, no organization, it doesn't matter how big or small it is capable of mitigating every risk. It's just not possible. It's just not cost beneficial. So one has to be realistic in terms of, these are the ones we're going to worry about. These are the ones we might get round to maybe next year or the year after. And these are the ones that we're going to park unless they change in some way. And over the years, we've seen, going back to the cyber threat, we've seen that develop from next to nothing to a serious risk. And it's something which obviously national governments are concerned about, as well as individual companies. Now, as for the scenarios, I believe that there are two ways to approach this. First, you can identify the scenarios that management are most concerned about, and then look for the risks that might cause those scenarios to occur. But personally, I prefer to do it the other way around. I prefer to look at the risk, understand it, and work out what the effect could be if that risk occurs and the scenarios it then would fit. So going back to the fire example, causing the denial of access to a building, it could also injure or kill staff. So there are human resource issues. It may well cause some form of security exposure if a damaged site is not kept secure after a fire. What you may not have come across is something called a disaster tourist. And these are people that for some reason find it fascinating to wander through buildings that may have been damaged in some way to find what souvenirs that they can pick up. And those souvenirs could actually be vital to the recovery of your business. So this is one of the reasons you need to ensure that the assets that you've got in there that are protected. Okay.
So most companies have one person or a pretty small team in charge of business continuity. What other people and departments should they be pulling into this planning process?
Yeah, they could be pulling in just about any department. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about governance, because one of the things that governance actually looks at is the scope of what your business continuity program is going to include. You don't have to include everything, as I'll talk about in a minute, but you need to understand what is in and what is out. Now, if a particular department's responsibility includes the creation of a product or the provision of a service, and that product or service is included within the scope of the plan, then clearly they need to be involved. Conversely, if something is out of scope, then they could say, well, okay, we might need to understand what's going on, but we don't necessarily need to contribute to the process. So it's more about awareness rather than contribution. Then you have anyone in the organization who may be expected to respond when there's an incident. And again, they may need to contribute to the process to say, hey, you know, what you're suggesting, it's not going to work because, or we tried that last year for a different reason and it failed because of these situations occurred. So each organization will need to look at the scope, also look at what they already have in place, if anything, from a business continuity perspective or a disaster recovery perspective, because it can make a difference. I would recommend that someone is made responsible for business continuity management. And unfortunately, some organizations tend to look around and think, oh, he's not busy or she's not doing much. They can be the business continuity manager. Not always the best choice. Equally, in my view, having a business continuity manager located within IT is not a good move, because it implies the organization hasn't understood that we don't look upon business continuity anymore as an IT problem. It's a business problem. So once you've understood that scope, once you've understood what you already have in place, if anything, then you can actually start saying, well, these are the departments that need to support this activity. And the other thing, which is often overlooked, I mentioned the business continuity manager is possibly made responsible for the program, but you must also have someone who is accountable. And that individual, whoever he or she is, really needs to be at board level. Because if you don't have the mandate and the support from the board, then you're going to struggle to get your business continuity program to actually through to completion. Mm-hmm. So that's the best advice I can give you, and it will depend upon, as I say, the shape of your business continuity plan, the scope of your business continuity plan, and what your starting point is. Once you know where you're starting from, once you know where you've got to get to, then you can come up with a realistic plan to actually say, this is how we're going to make it happen, and who we need to support that activity.
So what kind of budget do teams need to put these plans into place?
Yeah, the answer to this one, Danielle, is similar in a way. I'm frequently asked this question, I should say, and the one thing that I tell people is that when it comes to business continuity, one size does not fit all. I think I mentioned in a previous webinar, so please forgive me, anyone that has heard this before, is that I was aware of the German part of a multinational organization was under pressure to put a business continuity plan in place. And they went to their Dutch colleagues and said, could we have a copy of your plan, and we'll change every reference to the Netherlands to Germany? And the Dutch said yes, but it won't work. And the reason it wouldn't work is because there were fundamental differences between the operations, even though there were similar products and similar services that were being offered. And that is true of all organizations. You can't take a copy of someone else's plan and make it yours. You need really to start from scratch. So as I say, the one size does not fit all. What's the organization trying to achieve? Just to protect themselves by developing a BCP, or are they looking to actually achieve some form of accreditation against an international standard? Big difference in terms of how long that will take, the level of detail that you'll need, and of course you need to pay someone to come in and actually audit the work you've done and actually decide whether you've made the grade or not. Again, what's the scope of the operation? Are you including everything, or are you just looking to ring fence a particular part of the business to develop a plan for? What do you already have in place? Same question as I asked before. Is there an ICT disaster recovery plan in place, or incident management, and so on? So all these things need to be taken into account before you actually say, what's it going to cost? What budget do we need? And don't forget that some organizations will say, Right, so we'll appoint Tom, or we'll appoint Charlie, or we'll appoint Frida to be the business continuity manager. Do they have any experience? Do they need training? Are they starting from scratch? All these things need to be factored in before you can actually say what is a realistic budget. And the final thing that's probably worth mentioning there is how quickly are you looking to develop your business continuity management system? You might be driven by a client saying, we're not going to do business with you unless we've got sight of your business continuity plan. Or even worse, we're not going to do business with you until you have achieved accreditation against an international standard for business continuity. So I hope you appreciate there are a different set of drivers that we're dealing with that can very much affect just how inexpensive your business continuity plan is. However, one final point on this. The Chartered Management Institute a few years ago conducted a survey of their members, and I think they had something like about 500 responses from international clients. And one of the questions they asked is about the cost of business continuity. And 81% of the respondents actually said that they believe their business continuity programs were cost neutral because of the benefits that the organizations actually gain from having business continuity in place before and after the plans were finally implemented. So if you do it and do it properly, at the end of the day, you should see some form of benefit coming out of it. That means that the final cost is negligible, and that's a pretty important test, I think, to look at.
And it sounds like kind of a hidden point of all this is that you mentioned in the last question that you need executive sponsorship at the board level, somebody who's accountable to your plan. That probably facilitates getting the budget is having somebody who's high up enough to control the purse strings, making sure that you have what you need.
Absolutely right, Danielle. Top management commitment and leadership. I mean, we're getting into governance here, as I mentioned. We needed to consider. It's got to be delegation and not abdication of responsibility. And it's ensuring that there's a formal process for performance measurement in place at all stages for the business continuity. But it's more than that, governance. It covers a wide range of points that are worth considering. I mentioned scope before. That's vital. We need to understand what the scope is. And it's the old question in terms of how do you eat an elephant? You know, one bite at a time. And some organizations may actually need multiple business continuity plans. I've certainly worked for some that have had. So the establishment of your policy would define your scope. And it may not be practical. I know I'm repeating this, but it may not be practical or even appropriate to try and put a business continuity plan together for your entire organization. And this is where the how to eat an elephant comes in. You also need to consider, from the governance perspective, of organizing appropriate training for everyone. Now, if you've got a business continuity manager who can't spell business continuity, let alone tell you what it is, then clearly they need some training. They might even need some hand-holding from a consultant to get them started. I would also include things like staff awareness training. Everyone needs to know what part they're expected to play if there's been an incident. It might just be go home and wait until someone calls you. But if they're not actually told this, then I can think of one example where there was a major incident, staff were sent home, and some of them thought, oh, it's going to be weeks before they sort that out. And some of them actually decided to go on holiday. 3 days later, when phone calls were being made, you know, come back to work, we're ready to restart, a number of them disappeared. So it's important that everyone in the organization actually is aware of what's going on, what their part in the plan is. And I think the key message that I can give to people is that if you've got a plan and no one else knows what's in that plan, you might just as well not have the plan in the first place. It needs to be communicated throughout the organization. So governance should cover all these points. And if you're the business continuity manager and you come across blockers, sacred cows, if you like, we've always done it this way, why do we need to change, this sort of thing, then you need that person on the board to unblock those showstoppers that you might be facing that you can't do anything about at your level. So that's the whole arena of governance. I'm sure there are more things that I could talk about for several hours on the subject, but those are, I think, the key things that people need to take away.
So for those people in the audience who may have inherited an existing plan from a predecessor, what's the best way for them to vet that plan?
Yeah, good question. I mean, this would apply to not just a business continuity plan, but it could be any of the plans, a disaster recovery plan, for example. I would recommend that they actually use an independent qualified consultant to review the plans. You could validate the plans yourself by testing, exercising, and rehearsing. But if you do this properly, and I stress the word properly, then it's likely to be far more expensive and time consuming than using a consultant in the first place. One of the key advantages of using that consultant is they can tell you if all aspects of the plan have been properly interpreted when they've been put together. Are they complete? What's missing if there's something that someone has decided to cherry pick, and I don't think I'll bother doing a threat analysis. I mean, that's a key part. Conversely, if you use someone from within the organization, there's a danger that being familiar with the organization actually works against them, as they may inadvertently make assumptions based upon their organizational knowledge, or perhaps read something out of a plan that isn't actually there. So bringing in a consultant, they've got no preconceived ideas about how the organization works, and they're going to take the plan at face value. And it's something which I've done on many occasions in the past. And organizations often appreciate someone coming in and actually saying, yeah, I've looked at your business continuity plan, you know your business, I know business continuity, and these are the things that I have found, here's my recommendations, and so on. And they can then take that away and make whatever changes, additions, etc. to the plan that's required. And it can be a lot quicker, as I say, just to reiterate, than actually testing it or trying to do it internally. So that would be my recommendation.
Excellent. So now we want to open the floor to questions. So if anyone has something that they'd like to ask Bob, just feel free to drop it into the chat box, and we'll get to as many as we can before the end of the hour. So Bob, I already have a couple of questions here.
Fire away.
Are there any professional organizations you recommend for additional resources?
This is a difficult one to actually recommend an organization. I mean, as I said, this is the type of work that I often do. And if you are familiar with a consultant that you feel comfortable with, then he or she may be the go-to person for you. But just to give you an example, last December, I was sitting at my desk here in Manchester in the UK while I was reviewing a business continuity plan for a bank that was located 1,400 miles away in another country. Now, whether I'm working on site or working remotely, I approach it in the same way, and I do that in three parts. I ask the organization to let me have all their documentation about business continuity. And if, for example, I can't find a threat analysis or a risk assessment, then I assume they haven't done one. I will confirm that when I follow up. And that's the second point. Having reviewed the documentation, I'm going to come up with a series of questions or concerns, etc., that I then need to talk to the appropriate individuals within the organization. If I'm working remotely, I use Skype. Or if I'm working within the client site, then I'll sit down with them around the table and sort out the concerns that I've got. The third thing that I do is I write a report. identify my findings and make recommendations. And this is the sort of thing that you should be asking a consultant to do. Some organizations understandably like to see someone on site. So I'm paying for you to do a review of my business continuity plan, so I want you on site to do it. I understand that. But for those organizations that may be, shall we say, concerned about costs and so on and so forth, if you use a remote service, then you've got no expenses for travel, for board and lodgings, etc., to consider. So take away from that particular answer the sort of things that you should be asking a consultant. How would you approach this? What will we get at the end? What are the deliverables? What's it going to cost? Can you do it remotely? Do you have to be on site or whatever? But that's the way I would suggest you approach it. And don't be afraid to ask people, has your organization used a consultant for business continuity? How did you find him or her? Would you recommend them? And that I think word of mouth is often a good way to actually find the right person for your organization. Okay.
Okay, so the next question is, I know you said there's no national risk register for the US, but are there state resources that I could look at?
Ah, right. Okay. That's a conversation I had offline. Yes. I should clarify that. I think insofar as I've never come across a US national risk register that provides a view of the probability of a risk occurring and the likely impact. Now, there is the Strategic National Risk Assessment, which Homeland Security is responsible for, but it doesn't appear to provide any information on the expected probability and the potential impact from any of the risks that it lists. Now, in my view, I mentioned the UK National Risk Register earlier. This is what I feel countries should aspire to. Although, for larger countries such as the US, risks will invariably vary from state to state. And consequently, a state rather than a federal risk register would seem to be perhaps a more sensible approach. I mean, let's face it, the population of California alone is 2/3, or in fact more than 2/3 in the population of the UK. And UK landmass covers an area of probably slightly larger than Minnesota, I think it was, which is 12th in the States. So if we consider the variation of risk, probability and impact from natural disasters, states with a coastline face a greater risk from hurricanes and tsunamis, and then those that don't have a coastline. National Geographic, I seem to recall, lists 16 states that have fault lines running through them, so they're more vulnerable to earthquakes. And aside from hurricane-related flooding, there's also known areas in the US that are at risk from flash flooding. Likewise with drought conditions. And clearly what we're seeing in California at the moment with wildfires is obviously a concern. And I think that's becoming the norm as opposed to the exception. Perhaps we shouldn't be worrying about catastrophic impact from Yellowstone caldera supervolcano erupting, or the mother of all tsunamis hitting the eastern seaboard, and so on. These are extreme examples. And you need to be looking at the things that your state in particular is subject to, and consider the probability and the impact of such a risk occurring. And that's what I think each state should do, and they should publish it so people are aware of the thinking at the higher level, if you like. If there's anything which is of a national and a federal importance, I mean, terrorism comes to mind, then certainly that's something it would be helpful if the federal position on that was known. They don't need to give away any state secrets, but they can provide you with information that could be helpful. So that's my view on that.
Thanks. So the next question is, how or why do you separate disaster recovery from business continuity, or do you combine them?
I would recommend that you've got two separate plans. First, what's the common denominator between them? Well, if you remember back to when I was explaining that you need to understand the organization and you need to understand how quickly you need to recover from an incident, that incident might affect IT, it may not. It depends on what's actually happened. But I found situations where an organization that comes to mind, they very proudly told me that they could recover their IT within 2 hours of a disaster. So they weren't going for a high availability solution, but they were looking to recover within 2 hours. Yeah, fantastic, great. But when I looked at the business side of it, they didn't actually need to recover for 2 days. So here we've got an example of the business and IT being out of sync. And when you look at the business impact analysis, you should be both working to the same parameters. I mean, here we're talking about your recovery time objectives, and they should go hand in hand. And while I would expect IT to have a disaster recovery plan which is specific to IT, and the business is looking at things which are of a non-IT perspective, it makes sense to keep the two separate, because you're going to have two separate sets of people who are likely to be dealing with it, unless you've got a common problem, such as a building burning down and the data center happens to be in that building. Then everyone's in trouble. So my recommendation is to keep them separate, but make sure they are in sync. That's vital. And for those organizations that have an IT plan and had that in place before the business continuity plan was produced, then they should have gone through a gap analysis like this organization I've just mentioned, with the difference of 2 hours to 2 days. What is the actual figure that should be working to? And in some cases, IT may turn around and say, we can't do it in 2 hours. Then okay, you need some conversations, but that's part and parcel of business continuity and the gap analysis. Okay.
Great. So this one's a long one, but I think you're going to like it, Bob. A couple of technical questions. In a risk
Yep.
assessment, we rate scenarios based on two types of existing mitigations. One, those to lower the likelihood of interruption, and two, those to mitigate the impact of interruption. My experience is that nearly every mitigation that limits interruption impacts can be classified as a recovery mechanism that is eligible for inclusion in the BCP. Besides inventory and insurance, can you give examples of such mitigations that are not recovery mechanisms?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Congratulations, whoever posted it. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the situation with mitigation, what are we trying to do? Yeah, quite right. We're looking to reduce the probability of a risk occurring, reduce the impact if it does occur, or both. And certainly that should feature in your planning to say that this is what we're doing, and as a consequence, because of the sprinkler systems we put into a building, we expect the damage from fire to be reduced accordingly. So it might be just localized. It could even be water damage caused by the sprinkler system rather than the fire. In terms of examples of mitigations that are not recovery mechanisms, difficult to make a distinction, because I would look at these as more preventative than actually recovery. I would look at contingency more as part of the recovery thing. In the event that this happens, this is what we're going to do. So it's a very good question. And outside, and just looking at the final point there, mentions the insurance industry. Why would it mention the insurance industry? Because the insurance industry is part of the financial sector, and the financial sector is regulated, and they don't have a choice about implementing a business continuity program. They've got to do it because, as I say, the regulation. But I can't actually think of situations where, as I say, they're not used as a recovery mechanism. So that one I don't think I can help you with.
And then another question here. How do you get leadership to identify risk thresholds that can be tied to RTOs rather than the mindset of just recover as quickly as possible? I think this is probably a follow-on to what you said about the disjunct between an IT recovery plan trying to get things up in 2 hours and that they really needed it, that they could wait 2 days.
Well, yes, that's right, Danielle. And in fact, I think it's more than that. I can see the question in front of me now. One of the things that I think is vital is to keep the sponsor, and bear in mind that that's the person, in my view, that should be sitting on the board, that is the one that you go to if you've got blockers, etc., etc. If you're in the situation of saying, hey, we've identified this risk, we estimate that the probability of it happening is this, and the likely impact is that, don't go to them with a problem, go to them with a solution. We recommend that we mitigate it in this way, or we believe that these contingency measures would help the organization continue working while that particular risk is being addressed. Can they be tied to RTOs rather than the mindset of just recover as quickly as possible? Yeah, that latter is a major problem. I think with some organizations, spare me the detail, just go and fix it. You know, that you need something more definite than that. And for those people that aren't sure about what an RTO is, it's a recovery time objective. That is the time you are looking to resolve a problem and get normal operations back and running. That could be measured in days, or in some cases it can be measured in hours, but generally you'd expect it to be days or weeks or months. Okay, and I think it's important that you communicate the problem, e.g. the risk, the thresholds that are involved with that risk, the recommendation in terms of how that is addressed, and also, as I say, the potential impact of doing nothing. And if you remember, I said that management will look at risks and say, don't like that one. Yeah, okay, yeah, we'll buy into that. You can have the budget to mitigate that or come up with contingency. Others, they will say, we understand, we accept it. And if they go down the route of saying we accept it, then that is their call. That's what they're paid for. And what you need to do is to get that in writing. Because remember what I said, if it's not in writing, it was never said or it didn't happen.
Right.
So for your own peace of mind, sorry to use the expression, cover your butt, actually get it in writing. So that's their prerogative.
So Bob, I think that that's all the time that we have questions for. Thanks so much for joining us today. This was excellent. And if anyone has any other questions, we can try and write a follow-up blog post to address them. I just wanted everyone to know that we asked Bob to take all of this knowledge and experience that he has about helping businesses create solid business continuity plans and poured them into this business continuity assessment tool for us. So this is a 10-question assessment that will help you understand, get a maturity score for your business continuity plan, and then help you identify the places that you're weak and where you can give you specific advice for where you can improve. So in the follow-up email to this webinar, that will contain the recording. We'll also send you a link to this business continuity assessment, and we're really proud of it. I mean, and Bob's knowledge that went into this is just fantastic. So we hope that you enjoy it and find it useful. And next time, our next webinar is actually going to be an update to our most popular webinar, Active Shooter Preparedness, Life-Saving Strategies from a Law Enforcement Expert. We're inviting Jay Bryant, who did the original webinar, back to include, it's going to include all of the same foundational material and strategies that he went over the first time, but with the addition of some new facts and new information kind of based on the evolution of our understanding of how to prepare for active shooters. So this is going to be on August 23rd at 2 p.m. Eastern, and we hope that you join us for that one.
Danielle, can I just say something about that? I was reading an FBI report a day or so ago, and the figure that they quoted is that 42% of active shooter incidents are targeting businesses. and
Yeah,
20% educational facilities.
it
So
really, it really is a much, businesses don't get the same media coverage as
no,
schools
no,
do. I mean, obviously, because when it happens at a school, it just breaks everyone's heart. Not that it doesn't, wherever it happens, but it gets much more media attention than these incidents that happen in the workplace. And so, yeah, that's actually one of Jay's major points when he sets up when he kind of sets up this problem, is that it is more of a business problem than people realize. And
yep,
yeah,
yep.
he's really like a fantastic wealth of information about tactically what are the steps that you need to take. And it's always a pleasure to talk to him. So I'm really looking forward to that one. AlertFind, we are an emergency notification system for business continuity professionals. If you'd like to see it in action, you can schedule a demo through our website. You can also respond to any email from me, danielle.ricci@alertfind.com, or just give us a call. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending today. And if you'd like to follow up with Bob or learn more about his practice, his contact information is in the lower right of your screen right now. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you next time.